The rain hammered against the windows of Baldassari's steakhouse in Charleston, South Carolina, on the night Marcus Whitfield thought his heart had finally run out of reasons to keep breaking. He stood behind the maitre d' station in his black vest and pressed white shirt, watching couples laugh over candlelight, watching families pass bread baskets and share stories, while his own daughter waited at home with a babysitter he could barely afford, coloring pictures of a mother she would never remember. Marcus was 34 years old, a widower, a single father, and a waiter who had once dreamed of being an architect before life rearranged his blueprints without asking permission. If you believe that kindness can change a person's life, and that everyone deserves a second chance, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, share this video with someone who needs a little hope tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. 3 years earlier, Marcus had been married to a woman named Bethany, a nurse with a laugh that could fill an entire room and a habit of leaving sticky notes with tiny hearts on the bathroom mirror. She died in a car accident on a rainy October night, not unlike this one, leaving Marcus alone with their daughter, Charlotte, who was only 2 years old at the time. Since then, Marcus had worked double shifts at the steakhouse, coming home smelling of garlic butter and exhaustion, tucking Charlotte into bed with stories he made up on the spot because he could no longer afford new books. He told himself every single night that he was doing enough, that love could stretch further than money ever could, but some nights, standing alone in his kitchen counting crumpled dollar bills for rent, he wondered if he was failing her in ways she was too young to notice yet. That particular Thursday evening, business was slow, and Marcus found himself seated at a small corner table during his 15-minute break, staring at a plate of leftover bread, when a woman walked in alone. She wore a tailored ivory coat, her dark hair falling in soft waves, and there was something about the way she carried herself, quiet and guarded, that made the entire restaurant seem to hush around her. Her name, as Marcus would later learn, was Vivian Ashcroft, and she was one of the wealthiest women in the state, the owner of a real estate empire her late father had built from nothing. She sat down at the table beside his, ordered a glass of wine she barely touched, and stared out the rain-streaked window with the kind of loneliness that money could never fix. It was Marcus who noticed her first, not because of her expensive coat or the way the other staff whispered about her name, but because of the sadness in her eyes, a sadness he recognized because he saw it every morning in his own bathroom mirror. When his manager approached Vivian's table to ask if everything was satisfactory, Marcus overheard her voice crack slightly as she explained that her ex-fiancé, a man named Charles Pemberton, had just walked into the restaurant with another woman on his arm, celebrating an engagement that was supposed to have been hers. Vivian's hands trembled around her wine glass, and in that moment, in a decision that would alter the course of both their lives, she turned toward Marcus, the tired waiter with kind eyes, and whispered 5 words that would change everything: "Pretend that you are my husband." Marcus froze, unsure if he had heard her correctly, but Vivian's eyes pleaded with a desperation that no amount of wealth could disguise. She explained quickly, her voice barely above a whisper, that she could not bear to be seen alone, humiliated in front of the man who had broken her heart just months before their wedding. She was not asking him to lie forever, only for one evening, only for a few minutes, only long enough to walk past that table with her hand in his and her head held high. Marcus, who had spent 3 years being invisible to the world, who had grown used to serving other people's happiness without ever tasting his own, found himself nodding before he even understood why. He took off his apron, straightened his vest, and offered Vivian his arm as though he had done it 1,000 times before. Together they walked past Charles Pemberton's table, and Marcus watched the color drain from the man's face as Vivian laughed softly at something Marcus whispered in her ear, though neither of them could later recall what he actually said. For those few minutes, Marcus was not a waiter counting tips to buy his daughter new shoes. He was simply a man standing beside a woman who needed him, and something about being needed, truly needed, made him feel more like himself than he had in years. When they reached the restaurant's entrance, Vivian thanked him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and pressed a folded bill into his hand before turning to leave into the rain. Marcus did not open it until his shift ended, and when he did, he found not a generous tip, but her business card with a handwritten note on the back asking him to call her, not out of obligation, but because for the first time in a long time, she said, she had felt like someone actually saw her. Marcus stared at that card for 3 days before he found the courage to dial the number, his hands shaking the way Charlotte's did when she was learning to hold a crayon. Their conversation that first night lasted 4 hours, though neither of them intended it to. Vivian asked about his life, and Marcus, unused to anyone caring enough to ask, found himself telling her about Bethany, about Charlotte, about the architecture degree he never finished because tuition became impossible after the funeral bills. Vivian listened without judgment, without the pity he had grown so tired of receiving from others, and in return she told him about growing up in a mansion that never felt like a home, about a father who measured love in dollar signs, about how she had learned to distrust every person who smiled at her because she could never be certain if they saw her or simply saw her money. Over the following weeks, something quiet and unexpected began to grow between them. Vivian started visiting the steakhouse not as a wealthy patron seeking attention, but simply to see Marcus, sitting in his section, ordering the same simple pasta dish every time because it reminded her of the warmth in his voice when he described cooking dinner for Charlotte. She met Charlotte for the first time on a Sunday afternoon at a small public park, and Marcus watched with his heart in his throat as his daughter, usually shy with strangers, took Vivian's hand without hesitation and asked if she wanted to see the ladybug she had found. Vivian knelt down in the grass in her designer clothes, completely unbothered by the dirt, and spent 20 minutes examining that ladybug as though it were the most fascinating creature in the world. Marcus began to notice that his daughter smiled more often, that his own shoulders felt lighter carrying trays at work, that hope, a feeling he had buried alongside his late wife, was slowly finding its way back into his chest. Vivian, in turn, discovered that wealth had never once made her feel as valuable as Charlotte's small hand wrapped around her finger, or as safe as Marcus's steady presence beside her during the hardest anniversaries of her life. What began as a desperate lie whispered across a restaurant table slowly transformed into something neither of them had dared to hope for again, a real family, built not on money or convenience, but on two broken people choosing to be brave enough to let each other in. Before I tell you how their story truly ends, I want you to type the word "believe" in the comments if you think love can find us in the most unexpected places, even in the middle of our darkest, loneliest nights. 1 year after that rainy Thursday evening, Marcus stood at the front of a small white chapel outside Charleston, no longer wearing a waiter's vest, but a suit Vivian had insisted on buying him, though he made her promise it wasn't too expensive. Charlotte, now 5 years old, walked down the aisle scattering flower petals with the seriousness of a girl performing the most important job in the world, occasionally pausing to wave at guests she recognized. Vivian walked toward Marcus in a simple dress, no diamonds, no grand spectacle, because she had told him she wanted this wedding to feel nothing like the one she had almost had with Charles Pemberton. As Marcus took her hands, he thought back to that whispered request in a crowded restaurant, "Pretend I'm your wife," and realized that somewhere between the pretending and the present moment, it had quietly, beautifully, become true. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel, because stories like Marcus and Vivian's remind us that even in our loneliest chapters, life is still capable of writing us a second chance. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.